Greetings. This is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're taking a look at the September 1923 issue of Weird Tales. So the cover shows a woman being attacked by a lion while a man looks through a window. What's the story? We don't know, and we'll find out. One thing I can tell you is we won't find out in The People of the Comet. Weird Tales has done this for a few issues now, where the cover illustration and the title of the story featured on the cover don't match. I don't know why they do this. I find it's a bit confusing for potential readers, but there we go. The other thing is that unlike previous issues where the table of content was at the start of the magazine, in this case they've moved it to page 95. This issue again features two serials, the start of one and the end of another, and it also features 15 other stories. So we're going to go through these, and we're going to start with The People of the Comet, which is the new serial, the first part. This starts with a man describing a professor he knows who is rather eccentric. Apparently, whenever people discuss comets, he has this weird habit of pulling out a microscope and looking at the thumb of his right hand. Eventually, he will ask, why do you do this? Like, what does your thumb have to do with comets? Because it's only when people mention comets that you start to do this. The professor will agree to tell him, but he warns him that the truth is almost unbelievable. And he talks about one night that he was working in the observatory, two people showed up dressed in odd garments made out of feathers or something similar. The man will claim that he's from a far distant past. The only reason they can communicate is because not only is the professor an astronomer, but he's an amateur philologist, so he's learned quite a few languages, and he knows some Sanskrit, and it seems to be the language that this couple speak. They're from a far past where life was impossible at the equator because it was too hot on Earth. It was temperate at the poles, so they could live there, and that's where life started according to them. They tell their story of how they came to be here today in modern day California, which is where the story is set. And it starts with him being on an expedition to go to a comet. They have this weird theory that solar systems are like ginormous atoms, or atoms are miniature solar systems, and comets are like ions. It's a bit confusing because it doesn't quite match what I know of these things, so I have sometimes a bit of a hard time following because of this. I think our assumptions are different after 100 more years of scientific discovery. But in any case, comets are apparently really important to this model of the universe. This man from the distant past goes up in what they call an ether ship. He will approach the comet, which is described as this bright red burning thing. It's got three parts: the tail, the head, but around the head is a flaming area. He will manage to go through this area, through a gap in it, and land on the comet itself and discover that there are people there. At this point, we're told that we will find out what happens next in the next issue of Weird Tales. I had a bit of a hard time tracking the so-called scientific side of it because my assumptions are not the ones that someone 100 years ago would have. To give you a quick example, the idea of the dirty snowball for a comet, which is pretty much what all our observations have demonstrated this to be, was proposed in 1950, so like a quarter of a century after this story was published. I can't blame the author for making wrong assumptions, but it can still sometimes confuse me a bit. Otherwise, the story is odd. I still don't understand what the guy staring at his thumb and what the relationship to comets are, so I guess we'll maybe find out in the next issue. Maybe by then I'll be able to give you a better assessment of what I thought of the story. The next story is The Black Patch, which I liked less than some of the other stories by Julian Kilman I've read. It is about a man who goes to visit a distant uncle. Said uncle apparently had insisted that an inheritance he was due be paid in gold, so this man has to bring the gold to him. When he gets to the house, a man with a black eye patch opens the door, asks if the visitor is his cousin. So it's a distant cousin once removed, to which he said, if you are David Warren, then yes, I am your cousin. And the man says he is. He stays there for a few days for some reason, which is unclear, and this is what really made me not get into the story. He decides not to just give the gold to his cousin. For no apparent reason, says, oh, I don't have the gold. I was worried about bringing it here. I deposited it in a bank for safekeeping. The first night he sleeps in the house, he hears like a voice asking for help, but he's not sure what that is. In the second night, he sort of wakes up and he feels somebody pawing around for the gold, which he's actually hidden on his person. He pretends to be asleep, and when the gold is not found, the intruder leaves the room. A few minutes later, he hears the sound of two people fighting, so he comes out, but it's dark. He can't quite make out who's who. He ends up fighting one man. They're sort of choking each other, and he will grab the man's head, and his finger will go into the eye hole, and he's like, oh my God, but it also hurts the other man, who runs away. He will pursue him, and the man will actually, it's unclear why he would, jump down a bridge to his death. And then when he comes back to the house, he finds the other person who'd been fighting, who's his uncle. But he also finds that underneath the eye patch, he has an eye. As it turns out, the man who ran away and jumped to his death was his actual uncle. This is somebody who intercepted the letter saying he's coming with the gold, hid the fact from the uncle, imprisoned him in a closet in the house, and took the place of the uncle, pretended to be him so he could get his hands on the gold. I found this disappointing. The character motivations are not even present. It really could have used some serious editing and a bit of rewriting to explain the actions of the characters more. The next story is The Soul of Peter Andrus. As the title would tell you, it concerns Peter and his soul. He's a young man when his parents pass away, and the story is narrated by a doctor. He's in college, and he will announce his intention to marry a girl, Aileen, who the doctor disapproves of. However, he knows better than to try to convince Peter to not marry her. And as luck would have it, he proposes to her and she asks to wait for a year before they get married. He is despairing of this. He doesn't want to wait. The narrator takes advantage of this and suggests maybe you should go travel the world in the hopes that he will get over her. While he is gone, she just keeps going out, dancing, and she becomes enamored of a rather well-to-do young man. The doctor tries to get this young man to let Aileen be. While she's a little bit wild, she is at heart a good girl, and he thinks maybe by the time Peter comes back, she would have reformed. Peter does come back faster than the doctor would have expected. It seems that he was in India. He's consulted with mystics and learned from them, and he knew that he should come back. He will find out that the young man has taken advantage of Aileen. He will be angry about this, and he will tell the doctor, from now on, in the eyes of God, I am a murderer. The doctor tries to stop him. However, he does not appear, as he says, in the eyes of the law, I'm not a murderer. And what he will do is use these psychic talents he learned of in the East and kill the man. However, his own soul gets destroyed in the process, and he essentially becomes a soulless husk, will die. And he questions the fact whether or not Peter Andrus, when he died, had a soul. I don't go for the stories with mystical arts and nothing more. It doesn't do much for me. Competently written enough, the characters are well outlined, but the whole soul thing just didn't hook me. The Case of Dr. Johnstone is about a doctor and his death. It opens with the narrator reading about his death in the newspaper. We find out that Dr. Johnstone had become insane 6 years previous, and now we find out what really happens from the narrator, who was a medical researcher like Dr. Johnstone, and they often worked together. The narrator seeing Dr. Johnstone as his mentor. He will be doing research about the mind He will call someone he sees as a pupil, the narrator, to come and help him prove that the mind is something separate from the body. And what they will do is hook up a bunch of electrodes to Dr. Johnstone's head and to the head of an orangutan. The apparatus will then be turned on and apparently transfer the soul of the monkey to Dr. Johnstone and vice versa. However, Dr. Johnstone's body was not restrained, which means that when the monkey soul takes over, it panics, it runs around, and it destroys the apparatus, and it means the souls cannot be transferred back to the original bodies. He still attempts to do some research in the body of the monkey. Eventually, the monkey runs away, and what everybody believes is Dr. Johnstone gone insane is actually the body of Dr. Johnstone with the soul of a monkey in it. It feels really cliche, probably because we've read a lot of stories like this. I do feel that the whole thing was a bit contrived. They restrained the body of the monkey, but not of Dr. Johnstone in the experiment, so that when the soul transfer is done, Dr. Johnstone, who is in the body of the monkey, can't get up right away until he is released. But the monkey goes wild in the lab. It seems very contrived. They're acting quite stupid, if you ask me. Next, we have the dead naming of Luuk. This is set in Hawaii and is about someone who's seen as a witch doctor or sorcerer of sorts. Most people avoid where he is. He's near a crossroads, but whenever they go by as quickly as he can. And this one young man is frustrated that he's regularly asked by the sorcerer to give him part of his catch after a day of fishing. And at one point he won't do it. And then the sorcerer will tell him he is dead, that he shall die. He panics at this, says, I'm dying, I'm dying. He said I would die, he said I would die. And eventually he does die. Meanwhile, the narrator wonders why. Is it because magic is actually real, or because the young man believed the magic was real? It's a one-page story. It's a quick read. Nothing groundbreaking, if you ask me. It might have been at the time seen that way. I'm not sure. The Cup of Blood is about a haunted Scottish castle. After World War I, two Americans decide to tour Scotland on foot. They go camping. Hearing about this castle, they decide to check it out. One of them states he will sleep in it. After hearing the story of the castle, that it's haunted, that the last people to live in it was a rather cruel man and his kind wife who was under his thumb, she would try to make up for whatever harm he would do as the Lord. There was only so much she could do. He suspects her of cheating on him. He will send her away while the castle is being renovated. He brings in foreigners to do the work. She will disappear, as will the man who the Lord suspects she is cheating on him with. Shortly after, he will die, and he will ask to be buried according to some very specific instructions. Our two travelers will find out that he had actually imprisoned his wife and her suspected lover in a secret compartment of the castle where they would die. Their screams asking for help were thought to be ghosts, and instead of bringing help, caused everyone to run away. When the Lord died, the casket goes down a slide into a room, and it turns out one of the two travelers falls into that slide. His friend will help him out of the secret compartment. They discover everything, let nearby villagers know what was there and what had actually happened, and that the castle is actually not haunted. Bit gruesome, didn't do much for me. I don't go for these haunted house stories too much, so... Black Magic is apparently the translation of a French article that was originally published in 1860, so this is like 63 years later. It's a recounting of the fate of a black magician, what evil things he did, how he was caught, and eventually tried by the Inquisition and killed by them. If you're into that sort of thing, you might get a kick out of it. The Devil's Cabin is about a couple of explorers in the jungle. They have some natives with them. They're in South America somewhere. One of them is nicknamed the Beast. He's brutal. No one likes him. One of the other porters is always afraid of him. They will eventually get to a nearby cabin. They're warned away from it. One of them decides, I don't believe in ghosts and devils and other things that could be haunting this devil's cabin. I will sleep in it. And it turns out that some creature that lives in the jungle will be in there. What happens is that the porter knows of some herbs and stuff that will either attract or repel this creature. And he will give a little pouch of the repelling herbs to the man who's going to sleep in the cabin. And he's going to sneak a piece of monkey meat, which is what attracts this creature, into the guide that he hates, into his pocket. And at night, when the creature attacks, it of course avoids the people who have the herbs that repel it, and it goes for the one that has an odor that attracts it. It didn't do much for me, this story. The next story is The Old Burying Ground. On the whole, the plot is about a railroad construction crew that have to cut through an old native burying ground in the northwestern US. One of the members of the crew is actually a native from that area, but he does the work nevertheless, and some strange things start to happen. People see natives in traditional garb, armed with bows and arrows and not rifles. In fact, at one point, some of them see an arrow being shot, and when they find it, it's actually an old-style arrow with a flint head. And the crew is getting more spooked. Odd things are happening, delaying the work. This is the kind of story we've seen before. At one point, a group of natives on horseback will appear, and the member of the construction crew, who is a native, will recognize him as an ancient chief of the tribe, run off, and will never be seen again until the narrator, who years later will go through that area again, will see an old native there and recognize him as the person he worked with. One of the things they did in this story is spend about 2 pages just explaining the area, the tribe, what happened to them historically, the way they were pushed out of their lands, things like that. So they really make sure you don't assume anything about the circumstances. This is the kind of thing that would often just be quickly telegraphed today, but is quite meticulously explained here. I quite liked it. It's a very slow build-up. There's no big dramatic thing. A lot of odd things are happening. You can never be 100% sure that there is no supernatural things happening. None of the things that are witnessed are physically impossible. They're just unlikely. Some people have contradictory testimonies as to what happened. That might be the most odd thing about what's happened, is that at one point somebody says he saw something and somebody who was also there says, no, I didn't see anything. So there's no clear supernatural element, but is very strongly hinted at. I quite like that ambiguity. That was a good story overall. Very nice build-up. Next, we have the conclusion of the serial started in the previous issue. Just to quickly recap, 5 adventurers find an island in the middle of a river. There's a pyramid. They climb up. They find a huge diamond, meters in diameter. They also see a beautiful dancer who dances with a gigantic centipede. They get captured and they're each separated into individual cells. One of them is taken out and the other 4 believe him to have been sacrificed, and now they believe it's going to be their turn next. However, just as things seemed worse for them, their companion, who they thought had been sacrificed, comes back and manages to save them. He explains how he escaped. They overcome their captives, who is just this young girl they saw dancing and an old woman. They actually find the old woman dead. They didn't need to do anything. She was quite aged. They start to leave. and then they see a figure coming out of the pyramid dressed in pilot's clothing. Previously, they'd found a hydroplane near the pyramids, so they think this is the pilot. They go back, and it turns out it's the young woman who then tells her story about she arrived there. There was an accident. She had lost her mind, and she was just following what people were asking her to do, kind of like everything was a dream. They forgive her, and they eventually all make their way back to civilization. I found this conclusion to be unsatisfying. I mean, when you think they're going to leave the pyramid, the entire section afterwards just seems tacked on to add some word count. It wasn't satisfying. Another serial. So far, they're not doing great. Their short stories tend to be better. Next, we have The Gorilla, another story with a close relative of man. This one narrated by someone who late at night hears somebody knocking at his door frantically. He opens the door. Someone he knows, his friend Chadwick, shows up, asks to quickly close the door, and relates the story of how a few years before he was in an expedition to capture some gorillas for the local zoological garden. They'd captured a whole bunch of them, including an adult female that he had wounded with a pistol, stunned it, put it in a cage. It also had a young, and they separated the two. Not the smartest move, if you ask me. And then the man killed the young in front of its mother, enraging it. A day or two later, the gorilla escapes from its cage and is not seen again. So they return back to wherever they live. It's actually not mentioned, but I'll assume it's somewhere in the US. Everything is fine until going to a circus show, Chadwick sees a gorilla, and it is the very same gorilla whose young he had killed. And he knows this because of the scar on the side of the face of the gorilla. The very next day he goes back just to make sure, because he's very worried about this, and he finds the gorilla has escaped. He then that night will see the gorilla at his home. He will manage to run away, make his way to his friend's house. His friend tells him, look, it's late at night. It's like 2 a.m. Go to bed. I'm going to give you a room. It's safe. Here's the key. You can lock the door. Later that night, the narrator wakes up, hears some noises. It is coming from the room where his friend is. His friend has locked the door, so he can't just quickly get in. He manages to break through the door, and he sees his friend, who's dead, clearly having fought the gorilla who made its way in through a window. Looking out the window at the foot of the house, because they're on the 3rd floor, they see the body of the gorilla, and when they examine it, it has the scar on the side of the head as described by Chadwick. I found it to not be very engaging. Chadwick kind of deserves his fate. I think anyone knows if you get between any animal and its young, they will get back to you. The final line about it had a scar on the side of its head, I shouldn't have that much impact on the narrator because it's just something he was told about. It's not something he would recognize from first-hand experience. And similarly, I felt it felt a bit flat. I mean, it's clear that that's the gorilla in question. A bit of a disappointment, this one. The next story is called The Talisman. This is set in Japan, where a Western woman is living and working. One of the things she does when she's not working for a newspaper is to study Japanese folklore. She knows a Japanese woman who will talk to her about it, showing her items that will protect people from various evils. And at one point, this Japanese woman will say, well, I have to go back to my family far away. I will give you this talisman. You should keep it with you at all times. It will protect you. It's a little wooden talisman with some writing upon it. So she just puts it in her pocket and forgets about it. A short while later, she's reading in her house in one of her favorite chairs. Above the chair are some shelves affixed to the wall. And all of a sudden, for no reason that she can discern, she quickly gets up, scattering whatever papers she had on her lap, rushes away from the chair, and by the time she turns around, the nails holding the shelves have broken, causing them to collapse, and all the books and some statues and other things fell right where she was, and it would likely have killed her had she not gotten up. She then finds out that the talisman in question was broken in half after this incident, and she was told that this would happen should the talisman's magic protect her. That's about it. It's the kind of story we see rather often where something happens. It could be because of a supernatural cause, but it's not 100% sure. And the people put great weight on the probable supernatural cause. Next is the Autobiography of a Blue Ghost. This is a very surreal story concerning a man who recently died, and he wakes up, as it were, from his death being a blue ghost. Turns out blue ghosts are the lowest on the totem pole of ghosts. A lot of people who are dead, but to whom he owed money when they were alive, now hound him asking for their money still. There's some other rather surreal things that happen. Part of his problems are due to the fact that he is a blue ghost. The story ends with him willing himself to become a green ghost. Surreal stories are really hard to recap and not sound like I have no idea what happened because of their very nature. Surrealism was still starting up in 1923. It's a pretty good example of the influence of that kind of art onto fiction. I'm surprised it happened this early. Next, I'm happy to say that we have a third installment of Masterpieces of Weird Fiction. This one is a story by Ambrose Bierce called The Damn Thing. So the story starts with an inquest into someone's death. The coroner is there as well as a jury. The witness arrives. He went hunting with the person who died. At one point, they think they might have spooked something. The witness thinks it might have been a bear or something like that. And then he sees his friend fight something invisible. He will eventually succumb to his invisible foe. The jury will decide that the man died from being attacked by a mountain lion, but the witness believes that he was killed by something that's a color that cannot be seen by human eyes and therefore is invisible. I really like this story. It's well told. It has that humor that Ambrose Bierce is known for. And it touches both on the horror aspect with the man being stalked by an invisible monster and a bit of science fiction thrown in with an explanation as to why the creature would be invisible. An excellent story. I can't recommend it enough. Next, we have a short piece by Farnsworth Wright, who within a year is going to be the editor of Weird Tales. It's called The Teakwood Shrine. It's about a woman who talks to someone who clearly she's just met. She's at a bridge and she has a small teakwood shrine, and she tells the story of how it is cursed. There's some jewels, some rubies inlaid in the shrine, and if you press on one of them, the shrine opens up and will reveal something horrible, and it drives whoever sees it mad. Of course, the person she's talking to offers her money for the shrine. She refuses. He tries to take it from her, but in the struggle, presses the release, opens up the shrine and looks into it, and again also goes mad. This does do what too many stories in the early Weird Tales didn't do, which is to not reveal what that horrible thing that people are seeing is. Anything we could imagine as the audience would probably be worse than whatever it is that the writer would put in. Clearly a step in the direction that a lot of Weird Tales would take, where it's mostly described in terms of the effect it has on whoever witnesses the unspeakable horror. A nice little story, a wee bit predictable but well written. Next is The Moneylender by Vincent Starrett. Starrett wrote Writers in the Dark, that was in the last issue. I didn't like this story quite as much, though that doesn't mean it was a bad story at all. This is about a moneylender, and he's being visited by a man who is asking for an extension on his loans because he's sick, his wife is sick, they can't quite earn the money needed. He's also late on his rent. The moneylender tells him he's willing to give him another day, but he has to come up with the money by the next day. In order to show how generous he is, he will give the man a cigar. The man leaves, enraged at not being able to get an extension, and what he feels is the callous attitude of the moneylender. Upon leaving the building, he will calm down a bit, decide he's going to smoke the cigar, just stands near the entrance, smokes the cigar, and just keeps leaving the ashes on a nearby windowsill. He then leaves. Later that day, the moneylender will leave the building. He waits to cross the street. A sudden gust of wind takes the ashes that were still on the windowsill and will blow them around. One piece of ash will get into the moneylender's eye just as he's crossing the street, with his eyes tearing up and trying to rub the irritant out of his eye. He is blind to traffic and will get hit by a car. Nothing supernatural as such, just a bit of an eerie coincidence. Still well written, but less interesting than his previous effort. Then we have The Bloodstained Parasol. This is about an alienist, what we today would call a psychologist, who is visiting an asylum and sees a patient who is screaming. Apparently he's screaming about a dog and saying how she comes. She has a parasol and it's all bloody. The attendant in this asylum will tell this visiting alienist the story of this man, which was that he was a medical student doing research, doing a lot of dissection and vivisection. His fiancée happened to see a dog he was working on. She was so horrified by it all, she refuses to see him. She thinks he's a savage for doing what he's doing. She doesn't care that he believes it could help save lives. She feels that what he's doing is horrible. This will drive him crazy. And that's basically the story. And the bloodstained parasol is his fiancée's parasol that she had with her when she saw him working. Because he hadn't washed his hands, as she reacted to the sight, there was still blood on them, and where he touched her dress and her parasol, there were blood stains, and that just made things worse. An okay story. I find these, oh my god, this person is mad and here's the horrible events that caused them to be mad, to not be the greatest. Perhaps it's because we've seen too many of these by now, and maybe it was really fresh and new and different back then. And finally, we have the Erie, which is the letters column. As usual, people who writing in about which stories they liked and maybe recounting some anecdote that they feel might be of interest to the editors of the magazine. However, there's a letter that is quite important in this issue, and it is the first appearance of H.P. Lovecraft, who talks about how quite a few of his friends have recommended the magazine to him and encouraged him to submit some of his stories to it, which he decided to do. He states that there are 5 stories that he's enclosed with the letter, and the editors respond that they will be publishing some of these stories, and the next issue should have H.P. Lovecraft's Dagon in it, so we're going to have that to look forward to. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the September 1923 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.